I am Tyler McCann, Executive Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. And before we start today, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Western Quebec, the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Today, we will talk about intergovernmental relationships, and we will recognize that the relationships with the Aboriginal peoples also need to be reflected on more deeply.
We're excited to be hosting this webinar today based on the work completed by CAPI Distinguished Fellow, Dr. Grace Skogstad. In 2021, CAPI launched our Distinguished Fellowship Program in an effort to expand our research agenda into areas including trade, sustainability, and water. Dr. Grace Skogstad, who was appointed as a Distinguished Fellow last summer, has been focusing her research on the critical topic of federal-provincial-territorial relations in agriculture and food. Most of the discussion around sustainable agriculture is driven by agronomy or economics, but Grace's fellowship has enabled us to look at the issue from a different perspective, less about what we need to do to improve sustainability and more about do we have the right systems and policy approaches in place to deliver meaningful outcomes. Today, our webinar is based on Grace's recently published research, which looks at pathways to develop collaborative sustainable agriculture strategies and policy in Canada. Before we dive into the report and the discussion today, I would like to extend a special thank you for the support of the RBC Foundation. This work is supported in part by RBC Foundation's Tech for Nature initiative and part of CAPI's larger environmental initiative, Spearheading Sustainable Solutions. CAPI's work is only possible because of the support of partners like RBC. We recently launched our partnership program and value our knowledge and financial partners who make our work possible. Please reach out to me or Bree, our Director of Partnerships and Business Development, to talk about becoming a CAPI partner. RBC has not only supported this initiative, but it has recently launched a significant campaign looking at how Canadian agriculture can lead the next green revolution. I'd like to now pass things over to Gwen Paddock, Director of Sustainability and Climate Agriculture at RBC Royal Bank, to say a few words on behalf of the RBC Foundation to open today's dialogue.
Thanks, Tyler. It's a pleasure to join you today. RBC is proud to provide support to CAPI's Spearheading Sustainable Solutions initiative through the RBC Foundation's Tech for Nature initiative. RBC Tech for Nature is a multi-year, $100 million commitment by the RBC Foundation to new ideas, technologies, and partnerships focused on solving our shared environmental challenges. We work with partners to leverage technology and innovation capabilities to work to solve pressing environmental challenges. RBC Tech for Nature is a key element of how we're delivering on our climate strategy, which is the RBC Climate Blueprint. This strategy includes 4 key priorities: helping clients as they transition to net zero, holding ourselves accountable, informing and inspiring a sustainable future, and advancing net zero leadership in our own operations. In addition to CAPI, we're supporting more than 115 charitable partners implementing new ideas, technology, and collaboration that aim to address some of the planet's most pressing needs. If you're involved in a charitable organization that shares our goal to help make a difference, and you're working on a project that falls in one of our 3 key areas, which are data, innovation ecosystem, and communities of action, I encourage you to apply to RBC Tech for Nature for funding. Applications for 2024 will open in the fall of 2023. Visit RBC Tech for Nature website for more details. Now to today's webinar. Teamwork makes the dream work. What a fitting call to action. Canada's agriculture and agri-food sector's journey towards net zero will be a complex one, and it's a journey that no one segment of the sector can do alone. We need to talk more about collaboration, cross-sectoral partnerships, and teamwork if the sector is to realize the opportunities as well as manage the challenges that come with climate change. I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel on this important topic. Back to you, Tyler.
Thank you, Gwen, and we look forward to hearing what comes next in RBC's next Green Revolution initiative. I also want to highlight RBC's Tech for Nature Fund has made our recent doctoral fellows cohort possible. The reports from our fellows will be released later in June, and please join us on July 12th for the webinar that will delve into their work on the intersection of trade, food security, and sustainability. Thank you again to the RBC Foundation for their support of these important initiatives. We'll now move to a presentation by our distinguished fellow, Dr. Grace Skogstad, who will provide an overview of her research and recent paper to set the stage for today's discussion. We'll then turn to the larger panel one by one with a question and answer session, and then followed by an open discussion where you, the audience, will have the opportunity to ask questions. Please use the Q&A function on your screens to submit those questions. Dr. Skogstad is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia and a BA and MA in political science from the University of Alberta. Her research examines how organized interests in the agri-food sector interact with the shared jurisdiction that Canada's federal and provincial governments enjoy over agriculture to shape the policy making for the agri-food sector. She has written on the politics of the European Union's common agricultural policy, as well as comparative politics of Canadian, US, and EU policies with respect to genetically modified plants and renewable fuels. Over to you, Grace.
Thanks very much, Tyler. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I want to begin my talk by reminding us of the OECD's description of the triple challenge facing agriculture. The OECD defines it as follows. First, providing adequate, affordable, safe, and nutritious food for a growing global population. Second, providing livelihoods all along the food value chain. And third, doing so while increasing the sustainability of the sector and its contribution to combating climate change. The need to find a balance among these competing goals for agriculture is increasingly apparent, not only to international organizations, but also domestic governments, including those in Canada. It is also apparent that governments have an important role to play in striking the requisite balance, since the stakes and benefits extend well beyond farmers to current and future generations at home and abroad who rely on Canadian food production. My remarks today are directed to efforts by the Canadian and provincial governments to grapple with what is definitely a complex relationship between agriculture and goals of food security, sustainable livelihoods, and economic well-being in the agriculture sector, and environmental sustainability. This complex relationship is one in which agriculture can simultaneously be described as, first, a contributor to the problem of climate change and environmental sustainability owing to emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide from on-farm practices and land use changes. Second, agriculture is a victim of climate change as the economic livelihoods of farmers and others in the food value chain are put at risk by the increased frequency and intensity of storms, flooding, drought, and changes in precipitation patterns. And third, agriculture is a potential part of the solution to climate change and environmental sustainability, including with the adoption of on-farm management practices and land use changes that reduce GHGs and provide environmental benefits. Efforts are underway in Canada to grapple with these challenges and come up with a sustainable agriculture strategy, and that's the focus of my talk today. Next slide, please, Elise. Okay, thank you. As you are undoubtedly aware, the Government of Canada unveiled a sustainable agriculture strategy document in December 2022. Among its listed goals are to advance Canada's international commitment to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, to build on and adjust current environmental sustainability initiatives for the agriculture sector to support better environmental and climate outcomes. And the document also states that the strategy could, let me emphasize could, include targets for measuring progress on voluntary or mandated performance standards with respect to soil health, water, biodiversity, climate change mitigation, and climate adaptation and resilience. Next slide, please. The December 2022 document also laid out a process for coming up with a sustainable agricultural strategy. This process entails consultation with Canadian agricultural groups, and that is currently underway. And the document also states there will be engagement of the provinces and territories on how to best work collaboratively towards development of the strategy. And as many of you know, FPT governments have signed a Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership Agreement, and the intersection of that and the current strategy process is something that I'll come back to later. Next slide, please. Notwithstanding this process that's underway, there are clearly challenges to a sustainable agricultural strategy for Canada. They include, first, weak incentives for producers owing to prospective trade-offs related to costs or production yields. Second, effective approaches will need to be tailored to the diverse agronomic and climatic conditions of farms across the country. There is, in short, no one solution for all regions or even within regions. And a third challenge is the willingness and capacity of Canada's federal, provincial, and territorial governments to work with one another and the agricultural sector to find what has been described as tailor-made approaches within flexible policies. And these are deemed to be necessary. Next slide, please. Today, I want to focus on the FPT challenge. That is the willingness of the two orders of government to work together on a sustainable agricultural strategy. And as we know, federal and provincial territorial governments share jurisdiction over agriculture. And this constitutional reality gives them considerable authority for independent policy making. The environment is also an area of jurisdiction where both federal and provincial territorial governments can claim authority over environmental matters. Now, given this jurisdictional situation, it is the case that FPT governments often have incentives for independent action. And those arise not just because they're able to act independently, but also because they have different policy and political priorities. But at the same time, I think we recognize that they also have incentives for collaboration. Sometimes it's been necessary for them to pool, or at least sometimes they recognize that it's been ideal and necessary for them to pool their fiscal and regulatory resources to accomplish a goal and overcome policy gaps, or to avoid the policy incoherence and inequitable treatment of Canadian producers that can result from independent government actions, for example, when one government brings in a subsidy program and another doesn't. The really important thing here when we look at agriculture is that we really do see a past history of considerable federal, provincial, territorial collaboration when it comes to farm income safety nets, dairy and poultry supply management, and the resolution of agricultural trade disputes under NAFTA and the WTO. And it must be emphasized, I really do want to emphasize this because Douglas Headley, has emphasized it in his role as ADM at AAFC, that building the norms and institutions of collaboration around the business risk management programs for agriculture was the outcome of a lengthy, difficult, and time-consuming process that really did require building trusting relationships across FPT ministers and their senior officials. So what do we see to date? Next slide, please. If we take a look at existing agri-environmental and climate change policies, we do see examples of FPT governments acting independently, and I'm just going to list a few examples. This is by no means exhaustive. So for its part, the Government of Canada has implemented the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Labs and On-Farm Climate Action Fund, and it's also brought in the Agricultural Clean Technology Program. And provinces have been acting on their own too. And again, just a few examples here. Quebec has its own Sustainable Agricultural Plan, Agir pour une agriculture durable, and British Columbia's multi-year Sustainable Agriculture Strategic Framework is focused on regenerative agricultural practices and technology, and it also has a Clean BC roadmap. And we can go back to 1993 and think about Ontario's inauguration of environmental farm plans. And these, as we know, have since diffused to all provinces, beginning as early as the 2003 Agricultural Policy Framework. So these are just a few examples of governments being able to use their independent authority to act independently when it comes to agri-environmental and climate change policies. Next slide, please. But at the same time, there is evidence of collaborative FPT policymaking, and the foremost example is the most recent Agricultural Policy Framework Agreement, the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which will run from 2023 to 2028. And under it, FPT governments have agreed to about 2.5 billion federal and provincial territorial spending on business risk management programs and other programs for the agricultural sector. And they have agreed, let me just point out specifically what they've agreed to when it comes to climate change and environmental protection. First, they've agreed that tackling climate change and environmental protection to support GHG emissions reductions and the long-term vitality of the sector is a priority area. They've agreed in principle to a GHG emissions reduction target for agriculture of 3 to 5 megatons of CO2 per year. And they've committed to review how business risk management programs can integrate climate risk and readiness goals. There is also a new shared cost resilient agricultural landscapes program that will support carbon sequestration, adaptation, and environmental co-benefits for the agriculture sector. And that is, will be administered, but it's going to be administered by the provinces and the territories. And there's a cost sharing around the environmental farm plans to adopt beneficial management practices to promote conservation and environmental improvement. And that, of course, is delivered by the provinces and the territories. Next slide, please. But notwithstanding this collaboration, we are also all aware of intergovernmental frictions when it comes to agri-environmental measures. And I think the two high-profile examples that jump out immediately are the federal government's Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act, which permitted the Government of Canada to put a floor price, if you will, on carbon. And we know that Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario mounted an ultimately unsuccessful constitutional challenge to it. They saw it as an invasion of their jurisdiction over natural resources. The Government of Canada's methane reduction pledge has also been a source of friction. The Government of Canada has committed to a 30% reduction in Canadian synthetic fertilizer emissions by 2030 compared to 2020 levels. And that has been granted considerable criticism, not just from the farm community, but also Alberta, Saskatchewan governments. And the minister, the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada minister, found it necessary to emphasize that the target is voluntary. Next slide, please. If we taking stock of where agriculture is at the moment, this is my best calculation that Canadian agriculture is largely currently exempt from carbon pricing. And I would just note parenthetically that carbon pricing is believed by economists to be the most cost-effective policy instrument to achieve net zero GHG emissions by 2050. Animal and crop production emissions are excluded from federal and provincial carbon pricing systems. On-farm diesel and gasoline use exempt from Canadian government and some provinces' carbon pricing. And Quebec's emissions trading system does not include non-CO2 emissions from agriculture. Next slide, please. Now, the Sustainable Agricultural Strategy document lists a number of approaches to help advance sustainable agricultural goals. And these include regulations that establish performance standards and or mandate or prohibit use of a specific agricultural practice. And so it's important to consider the prospects here for FTP collaboration for environmental performance standards and targets. And I think the case is that the Government of Canada can set such mandatory national targets and performance standards, but it would be largely reliant on provincial and territorial governments to implement them and enforce them. And so the question then is how to get all the governments on board to do this. And, if we look back to the Agricultural Policy Framework Agreements, there does seem to be two principles around them that could serve as a kind of a basis here for collaboration. One is the 60-40 Federal-Provincial-Territorial cost sharing, by which the federal government is picking up, more than 50% of the share of funding. And the other is building in the EPF agreements and built in provincial territorial flexibility when it comes to specific programs. I think we could also think about two other conditions that could facilitate collaboration. And one of those would be giving provinces and territories a role in setting standards and targets. And then the other condition, I think, is if it becomes the case that environmental performance standards are important to the international access and competitiveness of Canadian agri-food products, I think the incentives to collaborate would be increased. So if we're going to get to meaningful outcomes in terms of a sustainable agricultural strategy, I think it's going to require the two levels of government working together. And I think the best way to think about this is how they pool their own resources. The federal government has, considerable resources in research, analysis, and it also deals with the international aspects of Canadian agriculture. And the provincial and territorial governments also have considerable resources and networks that are more oriented to on-farm implementation. Now, I do think it is the case that agriculture GHG emission standards and targets are attracting increasing attention when it comes to matters of international trade. The former Canadian trade negotiator Steve Berulis said that global trade policy must get more ambitious about climate change and that Canada needs to demonstrate that ambition. And I think this is an area in which Canada can lead, and it should lead, and it can do so in concert with the provinces and territories who, let me remind you, have indicated their support, in principle at least, under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership to a GHG emissions reduction target for agriculture of 3 to 5 MTs of carbon dioxide per year. And I think I'm really optimistic. I guess I'm one of those people who likes to think about things as possible, is that I'm really optimistic that the collaborative institutional norms that have been built up over decades in the agricultural sector will provide the foundation for them to jointly governments to jointly deploy their jurisdictional authority and other resources to tackle what I think most people see as really the existential crisis of our times. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace, and look forward to bringing you back into the discussion in a minute. But first, we're going to go through some introductory questions to each one of our panelists. I'm going to start this morning with Harvey Sasaki. Harvey is the president of Agri-Saki Consulting Incorporated. He served as chair of the BC Chicken Marketing Board from December 2018 to December 2022. Before his appointment to the Chicken Board, Harvey worked with a broad range of industry and government clients, specializing in agriculture policy and risk management. Prior to establishing Agri-Saki Consulting, Harvey worked for over 30 years in various capacities in the BC Ministry of Agriculture, closing out his public service career in November 2010 as an assistant deputy minister. Harvey, Grace highlighted some of the challenges that exist in this space, and clearly one of the big ones when it comes to agriculture sustainability in Canada is the big differences between sectors and regions in Canada. You've spent your career working in BC, in the government and the industry, positions that had you working with partners across the country, either in the federal government or national associations, ultimately representing kind of the unique nature of BC agriculture and a lot of the work that you do. I'd like you to start the panel discussion by diving into kind of that uniqueness that exists and how that plays out when counterparts from across the country are working together. And if you could, can you touch on kind of, again, how do you see those regional differences playing out? What conditions enable provinces to work together? And what role does the federal government play in finding those national solutions?
Thanks, Tyler. Quite the list of questions and areas, but I think they're all very relevant. And I think Grace has touched on a lot of them in her paper, and particularly highlighting, the fact that regional differences do exist. I mean, as you stated, British Columbia is very different in terms of its agricultural landscape. When you compare it to the prairies, we have much smaller farms. We're more diverse, and so the demands on the agriculture minister and ministry in British Columbia are very different in terms of having to balance the interests of many more commodity sectors than the predominance of the grains and oilseed sector and the livestock sector across the prairies. Not to diminish that there are other important commodities produced in those provinces as well. But in terms of things that drive response, I think that the Federal-Provincial-Territorial agreements, the agricultural policy framework that was started was instrumental in creating the dialogue on things more than just business risk management. I know Grace referred to it. My background had a lot of years of working on the business risk management side, and it made it easier because it was within agriculture's domain to deal with. It was difficult because of, again, these regional differences in terms of us in British Columbia wanting to provide a crop insurance for 10-acre strawberry farms versus the thousands of acres of grain production in the prairies, and how do you find some balance in terms of policies driven by risk management. We did find a way to do that and manage it to provide that line of support for growers. But a lot of times there are external forces that drive responses. And so it usually is an incident, such as Grace pointed out, Walkerton was one of those where it was something that was unimaginable in the minds of people that could ever happen. But it did happen, and it required a response and a change in practice, and led to the environmental farm planning, which then was subsequently adopted across the country by provinces. Similarly, we had the first case of avian influenza in a commercial farm in British Columbia in 2004. That led to changes in terms of biosecurity. We came up with some mandatory biosecurity standards that were required in all poultry operations, which ultimately found its way across Canada and is now, adopted nationally through all of the poultry and egg sectors. And so, again, the federal government plays a very important role in terms of enabling individual instances, such as the two that I've stated, into becoming national by facilitating it through the Federal-Provincial-Territorial agreements, and enabling provinces to adopt programs and initiatives to deal with those kinds of problems. But, they also set the bar in terms of, what are the federal objectives. And so they do have to comply with those in order to receive that kind of funding incentive. And they have been very open in the many years, over 10 decades that I had worked on the federal provincial file in British Columbia. There was that extreme flexibility that was afforded by the federal government. In terms of some of the sustainability side of things, I, being long in the tooth now and gray in the hair, I can say that, back in the 90s, the federal government had come up with a cost-shared federal-provincial initiative, the Soil Conservation Program, back in the 1990s. I think that was one of the first forays into environmental measures on a cost-shared basis. And, one of the things there too, again, to illustrate the flexibility, part of it was to address the erosion, soil erosion on the prairies. But for British Columbia, we wound up taking it, and our Peace River region, we adopted that. But the approach that we took was one of engaging industry in identifying the problem and the solutions and how they wanted to facilitate adoption using those joint federal provincial funds. And we established industry groups. And in fact, they were societies. We had 6 of them in British Columbia addressing 6 different areas. We dealt with soil conservation of Peace River. We dealt with the poultry industry, and it still has its sustainable farming group. We dealt with the landscape and nursery industry and some of their problems in terms of soil erosion. We dealt with the dairy industry, the hog industry in terms of manure management. Those were very important, producer-driven. So we had producers as directors on the board of the society. The province had provided the technical support. So our professional staff were technical advisors to that board of directors. They were enabled to hire their own extension workers, so to speak, to go and facilitate the adoption and put in place the technologies that were appropriate for the time. And, as I say, that the result of that was that we had very good result in terms of turning the Peace River region grain and oilseed industry into minimum zero-till operations. They're very successful with that in terms of early adoption. And we also dealt with the manure management issues in terms of the Fraser Valley, where we have our high concentration of dairy and poultry industries and our hog industry, which was much bigger at the time. So I think that those are the kinds of things that that can help. But in terms of, one of the challenges that I see within the provincial territorial domain, as it relates to climate or environment, is the fact that you have another agency, environmental agencies, that have to become involved in it or have the regulatory authorities over those. And so how do you engage them? At what level? Who are the right people to enable things to move forward, such that we don't come down with the hammer approach as opposed to the carrot, using the carrot to promote incentives to adoption as opposed to forced adoption. So I'll stop there, Tyler.
Yeah, Harvey, I want to pick up on that last point. I'm interested again in the difference between issues like BRM, where the federal and provincial government seem to have now a long history of working together. There's systems in place that enable that, versus kind of this issue of sustainability. And I want to get your perspective on, again, what makes sustainability different. And maybe if you could start by building on that point around how there's this other partner at the table when it comes to, environmental departments or other departments. How is sustainability different from the kind of the typical issues that agriculture ministers and departments deal with?
Thanks, Tyler. As Grace mentioned, Douglas Headley, I recall being at the table with Douglas many a times, and as I said earlier, the business risk management, change was driven through international trade agreements. Douglas, you'll remember if you're online, GATT, the precursor to the WTO, had wanted to impose limits and reduce the levels of income support provided by governments to their farmers. And so that provided the impetus for the provinces and federal government to work together, because, again, provinces would respond with ad hoc programs to address disasters or crises experienced on a commodity basis. And so I use that as an example of what was driving that change and that collaboration that ultimately resulted at the federal provincial table. And so within the environmental and climate change realm, there are many other players who come to the table in terms of who have interests, who, in some respects, set the targets that we have less say in. And as a result, I think we do need to engage them in that meaningful way to say, here's how we are looking at it. Here's how we want to approach it. If we don't engage the environmental agencies early on and build that dialogue, we can run the risk of having those kinds of things imposed, because, as I said earlier, they do have the regulatory authority and powers to be able to impose things in that way, which nobody really wants to see in the agriculture side, because it comes at a huge cost, as Grace has described in her paper as well. And we don't want to affect the economic viability of the sector with undue regulation that can be addressed in other ways. So it is a game, I think, of finding some examples, Tyler, of where we can coalesce around in terms of the provinces, or maybe it isn't, as simple as we did out of the Walkerton experience with environmental farm planning, that there are regional specific initiatives or issues that are combating the greenhouse gas side of the equation, and build on those and use those examples, and because, as again, Grace cited in her report, it's not a one size fits all. You're going to have to find different solutions, but are all contributing to that one common objective at the end of the day, and it is maybe starting with that agreement on what are those targets and objectives, and getting the environmental agencies to agree and support those, and then it gives us the ability to design within that frame.
Harvey, just quickly before I go to Dan, our next panelist, you talked about the sector being proactive. Do you think that the sector has achieved that? Have we come to the table with that plan that you just talked about?
Well, I don't want to step on Keith's toes on this one, and but I think that the sectors are doing things, in different ways in terms of arriving there. But I think that there's more that the governments could do to facilitate that in moving forward, and that's why I cited, our soil conservation federal-provincial agreement from back in the 90s of how we used it as a way of engaging industry. And I think in terms of it, that was one of the major successes that we had in British Columbia in terms of advancing the needle on environmental programming. And I think that that's critical going forward. And I'd be interested in hearing Keith in terms of his view in terms of that engagement. And by engagement, it is meaningful in terms of being part of defining the problem, designing the solutions, and actually managing and directing the program in terms of a specific target group and where you want to make that impact.
So we'll come back to that with Keith in our panel discussion after. Thank you, Harvey. We'll go to our next panelist. Dan Lucier is the founder of the Emily Data Initiative and the Canadian Agri-Food Data Initiative. Prior to working at Emily, Dan worked as a policy advisor and director of policy for Canadian Federal Ministers of Agriculture and International Trade, and as a researcher in advanced manufacturing at the University of British Columbia. He holds a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Manitoba and a doctorate in engineering science from the University of Oxford. Dan, you and I are both former political staffers, having worked in the Agriculture Minister's office, but you came to the Agriculture Minister's office from outside ag. And I was wondering if we could start by, when you look at your experience in other parts of the economy, other sectors, what's different about the agriculture FPT dynamic? What works, what doesn't, and what does that mean on the sustainability file?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Certainly great to be here. I think it's a really important discussion almost at any time. As the FPT reality in agriculture is sort of fundamental, with shared jurisdiction, as Grace mentioned, and certainly when wrestling with important questions, whether they be international trade driven or environment or whatnot, it's got to be part of that process. So I think it's really timely to be having this discussion. I think actually in my own experience, I came to it, as you mentioned, from having not been in agriculture before working for Minister Macaulay, starting to work for Minister Macaulay in 2017. But I certainly appreciated hearing some of Harvey's stories, like how we came to have the system we have now and some of the sort of innovations of process and sort of the needs that led to its creation. I think that's really important to keep in mind. In my case, I arrived into the minister's office as the CAP was in its final boarding stages. The agreements had been struck and the programs were being designed both federally and provincially. So it was a really interesting time to learn about sort of the structure of the policy framework, how it functions and how it's built. And also over the preceding time to look at, like, one, how does this sector and its policy table work, but how does that compare to what I've seen, say, in my previous life? I was working in manufacturing and in research, so sort of a more I'd say almost more ISED driven, if you're thinking it from a federal perspective, where you're mixed in with a whole bunch of other sectors and under one sort of ministerial or departmental banner. But the other way that I think is interesting is also thinking about this of what I observed in other sort of political staff colleagues or in different ministers' offices and their experiences of FPT processes. Sometimes were very different and different. Sometimes ministers, of course, have even multiple tables they're managing simultaneously. So at least from my reflections, I think one thing we should certainly note is that as a sector, there is a dedicated space and there's a focal point for this discussion. That, there's ag ministers at both federal and provincial levels who have the mandate to sort of steward and engage the sector and move it forward. That doesn't mean, as Harvey rightly said, that all moving parts are present in that conversation, but there's a focal point, and it's really valuable. And it's something that we should recognize, that when we're having to move forward in some way, shape, or form, there's a place for that discussion to be centered, even if we have to do work, beyond the ag minister's table or at the senior, beyond the senior officials from ag departments to derive solutions for other parts of government. I think another really important piece of this that I certainly observed was the value of that 5-year cadence. We've developed this system of 5-year policy framework, which provides a certain amount of stability and structure to the discussions. One, that stability has value, especially when you're talking about sort of core fundamental business infrastructure. That's like the BRM programs. There's a way to plan and for the sector to see what's coming over a longer time frame. It's not that other ministries don't have that, or other FPT tables don't bring that. It's just, I think this has developed it carried a certain value and has localized and has focused some of the deal making and necessary wrangling that needs to happen around that cadence, rather than having it be spread out sort of semi-continuously, which is something you do observe in some other, at some other FPT tables for either by design or perhaps just because of the nature of world events and things that occur that we cannot predict. I think another piece that I think is worth flagging is there's personal relationships that develop, because there are, in some cases, and I've certainly observed this myself, sort of ministers who have lengthy appointments. And I don't know that's always as true in some other spaces. And that can be really valuable, right? There's some institutional memory at the ministerial table. That certainly is true at the senior officials table. And those personal relationships are important, as there are going to be points of disagreement and so on. So that level should not be discounted. It's a part of the equation. It's part of what it means to finding solutions. And it doesn't mean it's like always peaceful and so on, but this structure has some unique advantages. And we're probably we are certainly in a phase where we're not everything can flow through just the framework itself. There's probably a yes and sort of situation happening here, both federally and provincially. When I certainly encountered the framework itself, I did see some of those provincial specificities occurring through cost-shared programming and sometimes quite interesting innovations, like provinces deciding at the onset of CAP to say, we're going to overhaul how we're delivering. We've heard from our growers that actually they would prefer a simpler, unified programming structure instead of what we had done in the past, and we're doing it. And in a way, that's a strength of the system, right? There's room inside of this for, yes, some amount of coordination, some structure, but also some amount of that like specificity provincially, but also things that even are happening outside of the sort of the formal framework agreements. And I think, we want to try to see that whole landscape. And it is something that I think is a bit unique to this FPT table and this sector. And we should try to leverage those unique aspects to, sort of advance the sector as much as possible.
Dan, one thing that's not unique to the FPT table is a political dynamic to FPT relations and kind of this inherent tension. But on the flip side, we see so on one side we see political tension. On the other side, I think we typically see a really good working relationship between agriculture ministers at the end of the day. And I want to touch on that issue around political will, because over the last couple of years, it has seemed like political will has increased. We've had tensions again. Grace talked about the carbon tax, the fertilizer emission reduction target. Yet last summer, we got to an FPT agreement that for the first time had a significant increase in new funding, had those carbon metrics attached to it, included a new program from a sustainable lands perspective. And so how do you see that difference playing out between kind of the political attention that we may see versus this reality that we've got to a deal that had some pretty meaningful outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of I pick it in a few slices there. At one level, governments are elected at different times by different polities. And so it's natural. They have different priorities. And that's like sort of, we should expect that. And beyond that, there's obviously the regional aspect, which drives some of that, each province and sort of larger region has its own set of challenges and opportunities. And, maybe that's the story of Canada in many ways, that we are asked and tasked to pull that together because we can be more than the sum of our parts. But at the same time, that's hard, right? So there's this like reality, we shouldn't lament it. We should just recognize that's always going to be true. There's kind of no way to avoid it. And it would almost be surprising if someday there was a lack of whether it's tension or just like necessary, deal making that's required to move forward. I think you pointed at something important, Tyler, which is like there are good relationships. And I think around that table, there's also a strong mission orientation. Like people are there at that table to succeed in this sector and to make sure that we're advancing towards, a place where producers are successful and that farm businesses are stronger and we're successful in the global marketplace. And, that those objectives are very broadly shared. And I think that's part of what creates that ability to work together. And that doesn't mean all the details, there's agreement, but there's that fundamental, foundation. Now, when it comes to ambition, I think ambition is good. It means that we can create a future that doesn't look like the past. But I would also say, just because there's ambition and priorities are set, doesn't mean that some of the conflicts we experience at the top level, like say premiers and prime ministers and in the media and some of that, that's political brinksmanship we see in parliament, that doesn't necessarily mean it all comes down into this, right? Yes, those things are going to be true. That's sort of, again, the nature of a game that occurs in politics. But sometimes you are able to leave some of that behind. So I wouldn't say we necessarily will see all of that imported. But finding an agreement on something is maybe a frame I would try to bring to it, because you're going to have to fuse together different priorities, and maybe you won't be able to agree on everything. The sustainability is such a broad thing. You don't find agreement on every element of what's inside of the current framework. So I think, realistically, we got to think about how do we fuse enough things together to make meaningful change happen, and how are we content, and how can we be content to take steps forward, to try new things, to experiment with them where appropriate, to learn from those things and continue iterating, because this is a lengthy journey. If we're thinking about sustainability, we won't get there in one step. And, thinking about the framework itself for a minute, yes, we just launched it as a country, just this year in 2023. The real work of the next one, 2028 and beyond, that really starts sooner than people think. We're going to be learning some early lessons from the first couple of years. And then realistically, if you back up from 2028, the hard work of building even the next policy framework starts really in a couple of years. So, I think it really is going to take, if you think about ambition, that really has to be grounded in concrete decision-making and not just nebulous about like principles and so on. You have to really get down to it. But it is also going to need to engage the top levels of government, because at the end of the day, financial commitments and fiscal realities matter. And that's where finance departments and prime ministers and premiers and their engagement in these issues is also incredibly important. Ag ministers, of course, receive a mandate and funding and funding support to go do work and to make that real. But that interplay is critical, and we can't ignore that either. There's this other critical aspect to having ambition and making that ambition real. So, I'll stop there. Happy to talk a bit more about examples of where I've sort of observed that recently. I think there's a few things you could point at, but it's kind of what makes this world fun, I think, Tyler, is how can we translate principles and high-level priorities into something concrete and work around the table with folks that may have different objectives and try to make something happen.
Great. Thanks, Dan. And so go to our last panelist and kind of build on that theme around engagement, because it's one thing for the federal, provincial governments to be engaged, but there's this third party, which is the sector and stakeholders more broadly. And so our third panelist is Keith Curry. Keith recently became the president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. He's an 8th-generation farmer from Collingwood, Ontario. He has over 25 years of board experience and has been involved in various agriculture boards and organizations at the regional, provincial, and federal levels. Keith's farm operation focuses on grains and oilseeds, dry hay, sweet corn, and gladiolus flour production. Keith has served on 3 provincial government advisory committees in Ontario, including the 4 Plan Review Committee, the Environmental Advisory Committee, and the Wetlands Advisory Committee. So Keith, we were just talking to Dan about engagement and how those relationships work, but there is this third partner that gets engaged, and that's the stakeholder community from farmers, the farm groups, food processors, civil society, and kind of this increasing number of people that have a stake in what governments do. I just want to kind of build on this. So you just came back from the World Farm Organization, and clearly sustainability is top of the agenda there. I wonder if you could just maybe start by reflecting on how you think Canada compares when it comes to sustainability policy and approaches. Where do you think we're leading, and where do you think that there's room for improvement in how we do this?
Well, that's an interesting question, Tyler, and I think in the big picture, in the aggregate scene, we are doing quite well. Various countries have their own issues that they're dealing with. They're all pushing hard to achieve some kind of sustainability initiatives, sustainability goals, especially as they're related to climate change. And we talked earlier, we heard earlier a number of times about the vastness of Canada and the regional differences. Now put that on a world stage, and certainly for countries around the world, their reaction to sustainability is going to be different. It's going to be different from a capacity standpoint. Do they have the finances? Do they have the will? Do they have the political support or the political will to start to achieve these goals? But I think the bigger thing for us in the farm community from a world perspective is my experience on the WTO scene in the last year and a half or so, a couple of years, is that two of the main components for agriculture negotiations are climate change and food security. And I think for those of us on the ground, the farmers, ranchers, producers, some of our concern with those two being really heavily focused on is that will one interfere with the other? Do robust, aggressive climate change initiatives by governments stand to potentially get in the way of some of the food security drives that we have to make sure that the world is fed? And it's a bit of a slippery slope, and can we achieve both effectively? And so that along with the sustainability initiatives around the world was talked about in South Africa this past week, but certainly food security was right up there, just as important to people, to make sure that we do not interfere with the ability for nations to feed their people. So it'll be interesting to see as we go forward how, we here in Canada, who are a very heavy export-oriented country when it comes to food, how our initiatives play with our farm community in particular as to being progressive in our production and not hindering our opportunities to help feed the world from a food security aspect.
And so Keith, do you think we have the right systems, the right approaches, the right models in place to get to that balance, to understand the different trade-offs that are involved between, again, environmental sustainability, but economic and social sustainability today?
I think we're getting there, Tyler. I think conceptually we have a lot of things in place. When you look at our from the production side, we have a large majority of our commodity organizations that have, instituted for lack of a better term, a quality assurance programs that really show how the producer produces what they're producing, and does it in a sustainable way. And there's, whether you're talking about the livestock sector, the hort sector, the grains and oilseed, the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, and there's also the Roundtable for Sustainable Crops, are all doing great work in highlighting, showcasing what our producers are doing on the ground. And I think as we move forward, there's a couple of overarching initiatives from the production side I think are going to play a really important role. Certainly the Canadian Agriculture Sustainability Initiative, which is in the process of developing an online platform, which will really highlight and showcase what the producers are doing from a sustainability standpoint, will really not only show consumers and people around the world what producers here in Canada are doing, but it'll also help reduce that complexity and the cost from the production side on achieving those initiatives. And along with it, we also have the National Agri-Food Performance Index that's being developed, which is really a farm to fork initiative of the entire agri-food industry. And I think that that will also go a long way, especially on the international markets, to show the sustainability initiatives that we're having. But when you look at, from the political standpoint, and it was interesting hearing Dan's perspective on the FPTs and how they looked, and even Harvey's as well. I think the FPT process is a good starting point, a good basis point for us for what we're looking at. And we just only look back to last year, we had that injection of money and an extra $250 million going into environment-related and climate change-related activities. The problem is there's not enough money there from the agricultural side to really achieve the goals required. And I don't think it's fair to ask the agriculture ministry to pony up the necessary funds to do so, because climate change is bigger than agriculture. It's infrastructure, it's environment, it's finance, it's natural resources, it's transportation. So I think, having said that, we also have an opportunity to use a conceptual program like the federal government's carbon pricing program, the backstop program. They developed an overarching program that puts a price on carbon, but allows the flexibility of provinces and territories to design their own plan, much like our BRM programming under the SCAP program, where there's an overarching program and provinces have the flexibility to adapt for their regions. I think there's an opportunity on the climate change side for some incentives and some incentive dollars to have a similar type of program that's outside of AFC and provincial ag ministries to really expedite anything that we need to do going forward. So I really hope that the regulators in this country walk before they run, and let's make sure that we do this right the first time. But I think we have the basis of some programming there now, because it can't fall back onto the backs of the producers to finance this, or it just simply will fail. It will never happen, because there's three main keys to sustainability overall. The environmental aspect of it is the obvious one to everyone, but people quite often lose sight of the fact that the farmers and even the value chain have to be profitable through this. So there has to be an economic piece to it, but also the social governance aspect is really starting to take charge of the situation, and both from a food security aspect, but also on political pressure from a social standpoint. And we cannot make policy on emotion. It has to be on evidence-based and science-based, and the data. And I know Dan deals with that a lot. But part of our issues with trying to achieve goals is you can't achieve them or even get close to them if you don't know where you're starting from. What is that basis point that we're starting from? So we can certainly gather data going forward to see how we're progressing, but we have to know where the starting gate is, and that'll get us to the end gate, hopefully in reasonable fashion.
Great. So Keith, thank you for that. We're going to go to questions for the entire panel now. And again, to audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A function to put questions in, and we'll take your questions from the floor, so to speak. And my first question to the panel, I'd like to go back to Grace, and it builds off, I think, some of the points that Keith made at the end, kind of these factors that play into how negotiations happen. I think that there's sometimes this tendency to take a look at this kind of variety of issues that people are facing, put them on the negotiating table, and end up negotiating towards the lowest common denominator outcome because it's kind of the easiest way to manage the process. Again, I'd like to get everyone's perspective on this, but we'll start with you, Grace, around, what does it take to, rather than get to a lowest common denominator outcome, get to an ambitious outcome that everybody can see and believe in? So Grace, to you first on this, and then I'll go to Harvey second.
Okay. So you're right about the lowest common denominator possibility and likelihood, but there is always the capacity for governments to do things independently. I mean, we're not really locked into a joint decision-making system in the sense that nobody can move till everybody moves. I mean, provinces, I've been hearing about initiatives that come out of provinces or initiatives that come out of Ottawa, and then they can get taken up. So yeah, if all you're doing is insisting that everybody agree on everything, then you really do get lowest common denominators, I'm sure. But if you create that flexibility and you also allow, there is always a possibility that things can happen outside the APM agreements as well. And so that can inject innovative policies And because we're a pretty small federal system, and because we do, in a sense of, 14 governments, 10 provinces, 3 territories, 1 federal, you can get all those people around the table, but it's also really kind of possible for people to learn from one another and for ideas to diffuse. So the possibility is always there, Tyler, but I think the institutional framework has more flexibility, at least that's what I'm hearing, to allow for innovation and for experimentation. And then, I'll just leave it there.
So Harvey, your thoughts around kind of how that framework enables that innovation to get to kind of bigger outcomes?
Well, I go back to another example. My experience was premise identification in the livestock sector. I mean, again, there were circumstances which, demanded it. Quebec was the first to adopt and come up with a system. Alberta wasn't, much further behind, but I think provinces were able to implement them in their own time frame, but they all had the same intended end outcome, was to be able to identify, where these premises were in the event of having to have some kind of emergency response. And as events prevailed, natural disasters, whether it be wildfires or disease events, that, prodded everybody along, faster than slower. And I think that, again, with the regional differences that exist in terms of production systems, it is going to be individual provinces in terms of doing their best and focusing on where, there's a willingness of the industry participants to make those changes and encouraging them and fostering those changes. And again, reporting that back. And I think everybody has a similar end, target in mind in terms of where they want to get to. And it's not being prescriptive. If we become prescriptive in how we get there, that will be, the death knell of trying to advance the bar.
Right, so we'll go to Dan and then end with Keith on this one. But so Dan, your thoughts on getting to ambitious outcomes?
Well, I certainly would agree with what Harvey and Grace offered, but it's certainly, as Grace mentioned, there's a certain flexibility that still exists, right? Not everything needs to fit in and to an agreement, a framework, a situation that's strictly cost shared. And that's actually really important to flag because there's a fiscal reality. If you're putting new things in, what goes out, right? Or how do you grow the pie? And is everyone prepared across the wider FPT table to make similar investment? That's complicated. So thinking about that yes and opportunity, do things within the framework, and what other things would governments on their own terms decide are relevant to their priorities and are additive, right? Rather than subtractive to the mission. Also makes me think a little bit of I spent about a year working for the Minister of Trade's office and had an opportunity to as a result, come into some of those discussions with people like Steve Verhoeven, who was mentioned earlier on. And one thing Canada is good at is trade negotiation as a practice. We have well-regarded trade negotiators who are constantly dealing with a wide waterfront of issues with their interlocutors. And that can create opportunities, right? The breadth can lead to an expression of priority areas, of sensitive areas. And through that negotiation with partners who have different objectives, maybe you find common spaces for action, right? You may not agree on everything. You may have to give and you may have to take, but by having a wider frame in which discussions arise and where some shared objectives exist, you can arrive at an agreement. And that function of having, like in our case, a 5-year opportunity for agreements is also something maybe to be thought about. Even though we may not agree on everything, at 5-year intervals, we have an opportunity to think what would be beneficial to do in the cost shared environment. What would be beneficial for the federal government to do inside of the framework, but in the federal only component, and so on. So I think there's maybe try to think this through as like a flexible process where we're learning from one another, and not to think we can go to the very end of it super quickly. It's going to be a dialogue. It's going to be a back and forth, and let's try to build out a way to talk about these things in a broad sense so that we can find the concrete things that we can do, in a federal provincial fashion, and things that are okay to be additive and that are beyond that.
So Keith, when you're thinking about getting to these bigger outcomes and taking Dan's point that you've got to look for those areas where it's easy to agree almost. Are there some of the pieces of the sustainability puzzle where you do see kind of more agreement across the country where they may be less contentious, where it is easy for governments, for stakeholders, and others to come to come to an agreement?
Well, I think if you look at initiatives like the Sustainable Roundtable on beef and on crops, I mean, that's certainly an all-encompassing gathering of those industries. And that's almost becomes a one-stop shop for governments to look at as they're going forward. I agree with Dan on the aspect that a 5-year deal gives you some longer-term vision, but the reality is that vision needs to be a 5-year deal within a 20-year vision to really accomplish what you need to accomplish. 5 years is a long time, but it's not very long. And part of the struggle that we have is the political whims of the day, the political will or lack of will drive this. And I don't just mean within government, I also mean as stakeholders as well. There has to be political will on the ground as stakeholders. And I think that we have shown in agriculture that we're willing to do our part. We just can't do it by ourselves, but we need some understanding of the practicality of implementing what we do by those that make the rules and the regulations. And if we can get them to understand practicality, that setting a goal is fine, but make sure that it's not thou must get there, because we may not, depending on a number of different variables, one of them being political, one of them being what Mother Nature does with us on the ground. And so we have to understand all those things holistically, which sounds like an easy thing to do. And it certainly, as Dan knows, and you know, and Harvey knows, it's anything but easy. But I think, if you do take a holistic approach, then those 5-year plans within a 20-year vision become a lot easier to obtain. And I think it's a lot easier for me as the leader of an organization that represents 190,000 farmers. It's an easier sell for me to get my members to buy in as well. And I think that's really the ultimate goal and how we achieve what we need to achieve.
But so Keith, one of the interesting things that's playing out now today, and I'll get your feedback on this, and then Grace give you an opportunity after, is that we have a 5-year agreement that's a FPT agreement, but the federal government is effectively trying to set that 20-year vision today on its own, or not, I shouldn't say on its own, but through a federal sustainable agriculture strategy where they're consulting with the provinces and where they're consulting with stakeholders, but that it will be a federal only strategy. But I think that's part of what they're trying to do, is to set that 20-year vision that can add some continuity and provide some long-term perspective. Keith, do you want to just talk on kind of how you see that difference between the federal government doing the SAS as a federal only initiative versus the 5-year agreements that are FPT agreements? Do you think that has an impact?
Oh, I think it's going to have an impact because, first of all, we're excited about the fact that we do have this strategy that's being worked on and built, and it's a strategy that is being built by the country, by the players across this country. And what that's going to allow the federal government to do is go back to the provinces and territories and said, we consulted from coast to coast to coast, and this is what we heard from the stakeholders. So that will then give them a little bit of leverage to go to the provinces and say, okay, your people said this. Now, how are we going to work together to drive this forward in this long-term vision, whether it's 10, 15, 20, 25 years, whatever that length of term is, but it will give the federal government credibility in saying, we know what we need to do. We heard from you people, let's go forward and do it. So I'm looking forward to the outcome of that strategy and how it builds. And I think, I believe that the federal government is really looking to take all the information back that they're hearing and have a comprehensive strategy going forward. And it still won't satisfy everybody. We have to understand that not everybody's going to like it or fit within it, but the majority are going to be buying into it because the majority are putting the input into it in the first place. So I think it's a good thing.
Okay. And so Grace, your thoughts on this difference between a 20-year vision and a kind of that 5-year policy framework?
Yeah, so the question is really about the interaction of the sustainable agriculture strategy process and the 5-year one. Well, I don't disagree with Keith, but I mean, the big question here will be how much consensus there is around a sustainable agricultural strategy. I mean, if we find that people can't agree on anything other than sort of very general principles and they can't really, come to grips with what the government of Canada is looking for, then that the federal government might have some leverage, but it's not going to be as significant as what Keith is proposing, that there really will be a consensus that comes out of this process about the way forward. So I'm obviously not part of that process, but I really do think that it is really going to depend upon what that process can achieve by way of a kind of a blueprint that is really going to be meaningful, whether that will constitute kind of leverage for Ottawa vis-a-vis the provinces.
Yeah, Keith?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on what Grace said, and I guess what I didn't say when I was replying to your question, Tyler, is that it won't be I see this strategy identifying the regional needs as well. So I think I miss saying that, but I think those regional needs will be shown through this strategy, and that will then enable the government to go back to their respective regions and say, here's what we heard, and now let's go forward. So yeah, if it's nationwide, you're never going to get consensus. We're too vast, we're too different. But I think from a regional aspect, those differences will be pointed out.
Dan, and so go to you, but I'd also like you to kind of weave in your thoughts on one of the questions, or several people have raised this point around the role of the non-agriculture departments, right? So we've got Agriculture Canada doing this, but we've got many other departments that are also have a stake. It's come up throughout the discussion. So your thoughts on that, and Harvey, we'll go to you next on that thing.
I guess there's maybe two comments, just reacting to Grace and Keith. I think they really did a nice job of sort of articulating what the opportunity is, because that's in a way what we're looking at here is work has been done. The federal government has gone out and engaged with stakeholders and provinces and so on. And it's an opportunity for a statement of what was heard, but also some clarification, some further crystallization of priorities. And that should be seen as an opportunity on which further actions can be done, right? It's not the end of the process, it's the beginning of much more. And I think that's really the way I would look at it in a lot of ways, kind of very much along the lines of what Keith was painting. But certainly the federal government, at least in my experience, is acutely aware that there are many regions, many provinces with different objectives and priorities. And it's like that operating at two speeds, recognizing and acting through those realities, and at the same time trying to say, what does it all mean when it rolls up? Trying to make sense of that when we're asked to account for ourselves internationally, when we're communicating the global value proposition of our products, what is underneath that, right? There's those two realities that kind of need to be fused together. Difficult, but important work. Now, in terms of your question, Tyler, of like, how do you engage these other important departments? And I think federally, I was trying to account for them in my mind. It's like maybe two handfuls of other departments that have something important to say about the sector. And it can be very challenging, right? There can be really excellent ideas around inside of it, whether it's agriculture departments or from ag ministers, and yet the action resides and the decision-making resides elsewhere. So I know we talked about it when a couple of days ago when we were sort of preparing for today. The solution is not to make the agriculture table 100 people sitting around in a ginormous conference center. I think it really is incumbent upon thinking about this FPT engagement and problem solving work as something that happens not just in a room with 13, 14 ag ministers or senior officials, right? These people are working offline with their colleagues across government, and there needs to be a certain amount of internal accountability within those governments, federal and provincial governments as well, to do that work. It's not easy work. That's some of the hardest thing I think that governments do, especially across the sprawling real estate of the federal government. But I don't know if there's an easy substitute for that. It's a reality that significant amounts of, especially the regulatory function, is elsewhere. Ag Canada is not the decision maker and cannot be uniquely responsible for solving that. They have a role to play, in my experience. But also it does require, of course, our stakeholder community within the sector to be doing direct engagement with those folks and building real relationships as well, and reminding these other government departments that agriculture is relevant to them, and there's it's an important part of the economy and so on and so forth. So I think it's sort of a multifaceted approach, but it does not have, I don't think, an easy solution. But it is perhaps also the call for some institutional innovation where there's key areas that we know about, like whether it's ECCC federally or Health Canada, who have really important roles in the system. So I don't know if I have a clear answer. I know I kind of covered a bunch of things there, but I think that sort of reflects the reality that it is a complex, high dimensional sort of space.
And so Harvey, you talked earlier about in that BRM, getting to a BRM agreement around the FPT table. Really, probably the other government departments, federally, provincially, that had an interest was the finance department. And clearly, as Dan talks about, I think that world is different today when it comes to this topic of sustainability. How do you see that piece about playing out around bringing the other departments to the table constructively in a way to get to good sustainability outcomes?
Well, I think that the forum is there. It is available because I think there is enough focus on climate change and the environment. So at the cabinet table, that discussion is ongoing. And so I think that, there won't be any surprises when somebody brings something to the table for that discussion to get, the government sign off to either enter into a federal-provincial agreement or to initiate a program and go to Treasury to get some funding to support those initiatives. The challenge, is that, staffing has been an issue since COVID and coming out of COVID. You've got fewer people trying to advance the the subject matter ahead, and the governments are driven by priorities or crises all the time. And Dan, Tyler, I'm sure you've experienced that in the past as well. So it, maintaining the momentum on something and having the discipline to continue to see it through, that is the number one difficulty for any ag department right now, because they are jumping from pillar to post on what they have to do. And I think, though, that it is set by cabinets across the country that climate is an important element of everything that is done within the mandates of the different departments. And I think there is an expectation on ministers to collaborate where they need to. So again, the no surprise principle, right? Don't bring something to cabinet that you haven't discussed outside of the cabinet room, so that we're having a full-on debate at the cabinet table. So I think that there are mechanisms in place and processes in place to be able to deal with it. But it is, how do you maintain and sustain the momentum that gets generated out of these things, and that it just doesn't become, a moment in time, and then, it gets shoved off to the side of the table because something else has come along that's a higher priority.
So we've got a couple of questions that are around the theme of what is the approach that we're taking in Canada to some of these issues, and is it kind of that stick versus like the carrot? There's one question about if you look at kind of the exemptions that exist on carbon pricing. Again, actually, what we do, one of the challenges around regional differences and kind of that federal backstop with regional approaches is that it could create disruptions in the internal marketplace, make it harder to go put potentially producers in one province in a disadvantage compared to the other. I was wondering, Grace, again, your thoughts around how these broader issues around kind of what is the approach, and how do you build systems that don't create those internal disruptions, that allow that regional flexibility to be recognized without creating regional disruptions or those cross-border issues internally that we get, and still do it in a way that looks at building and improving competitiveness at the end of the day. I know there's a lot in there, but your thoughts on that?
Well, first I'd like to go back to the distinction that was made earlier about the relations, the false impression, if you will, or the impression that one can get at looking at what first ministers say, and looking at that kind of political posturing that can go on at that level. And then when you go down a level and you get to, the line ministers, or you get to the officials, the relations can be very different there. And And so, we have some good examples now in the country of, of a couple of provinces that if you were to listen to the rhetoric of the premiers, you would conclude the Federation is in pretty tough shape, right? And particularly if we're going to try to do anything on climate change, just give up. And so, I think it's really, it is a kind of difficult file if you're going to have a first minister sort of dictating the agricultural policy for a province. So I don't think we should minimize, how difficult this file can be. But I do think that I've been struck by, in the wake of the Alberta election, that number of people and Danielle Smith's election victory speech that, she's going to come after Ottawa, basically. And I was also struck by the fact that there was nothing mentioned about climate change in that debate, right? In that whole debate that went on. So, but then, you hear officials saying, and various people saying, well, look, there is quite a lot that's going on by way of cooperation with the province. The ministers and officials are working and they're really trying to sort things out, get agreement on things. So I really do think that we have to kind of, it is difficult. These are not easy things. That said, we do have to kind of recognize that the Western Canadian provinces were ahead of the rest of the country when it comes to trying to remove interprovincial trade barriers. They struck an agreement before anybody else, the four Western provinces. I think it was for BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, right? They struck an agreement to try to remove as many non-tariff interprovincial trade barriers as they can. So the rhetoric and the actual work on the ground can often, be a bit of a mismatch. Don't seem to add up. So I'm not sure that's answering your question, Tyler, but I do think that Canadians want governments to work together. I don't think that Canadians, by and large, want their governments to be in conflict. I think they want them to solve problems. They expect them to solve problems. At least that's my take on it. Having listened to a lot of young people over the years in the classroom, they expect the governments to work for the people and to work for the Federation. So I always think that there's more mileage to be had in most provinces anyway, and for most Canadians, by trying to work collaboratively and cooperatively than it is to kind of pick a fight with the other order of government.
Yeah, and so Dan, I'm curious. One of the things that seems to have happened recently is an evolution from the stick to the carrot approach, right? We see this kind of further exemption on carbon pricing working through Parliament. We've seen, I think, the federal government soften its language around the fertilizer emission target, and at the same time, again, we had this agreement last summer where, despite those political differences, I think we saw governments come together with a pretty good outcome. Do you see that evolution playing out from, I think, more of a stick to a carrot, and maybe is the FPT process in agriculture part of the reason why that evolution is happening?
I like your optimism, Tyler. I think that's encouraging, and Grace is right. I think people do want, governments, and they want people like people working together. I think that's a pro-social, positive way to look at like finding solutions to sort of our shared challenges. Well, we might be in a lower ebb of different forms of negotiation or conflict. I don't know if that portends the future is going to be easy and smooth sailing, that it's all carrots the way forward or carrots all the way down. I think it without wading into it too much, like fertilizer has ebbed off as a top line issue that people are talking about today, but that doesn't mean it's solved, right? It's like we could easily end up in a very tense situation. But, at the end of the day, I think really one of the biggest challenges, and that's a great example, was about clarity and communication. And, there were also many other political currents swirling on that issue at the same time. Became quite complex. So on a whole, Tyler, I think it's like good to be optimistic, but I'm not sure we've necessarily moved past, some of the necessary challenges. And, nor should we, like we were saying earlier, get anchored into like the top line conflict. There is that work happening at so many different levels. And, ultimately, we're going to find, I think, the opportunity to go 2 steps forward here and a step forward there, and slowly but surely respond to the world as it is. Like that, why are we talking about sustainability at all today? Is because the world is continuing to evolve and shift, and global markets are responding and evolving their thinking around this. And, in a way, we know that that's an imperative over the sweep of the next 20 years is going to be important. How we get there and how we resolve some of the, whether they're fundamental or tactical disagreements, is very challenging, but it will certainly involve, I think, ebbs and flows of different types of disagreement and different types of conflict. Sometimes the worst conflict might even be before some sort of settlement and outcome is achieved, and I would try really think about how do we stay patient and dedicated, kind of like what Harvey was saying, and maintain that stamina that's going to be required to like run the race over the the coming years and decades.
So I'm going to shift to kind of the last question for the entire panel, and I'm going to pull some context for this question from one of the questions from the participants, and the question, the person was noting that so we've got Ag Canada that's launching the sustainable ag strategy without the provinces having agreed to kind of the principles that are in it. And the question is really, how can that succeed? I mean, and the comparison is given to we've had this announcement, this commitment, longstanding commitment now, almost around a national school lunch program, which is really provincial jurisdiction, but we've got a federal government that's announced a commitment to it, but seem to be having a hard time getting action. So, the question was really around how do we avoid that from happening again in this case? But what I'd like to do is go to each of you and ask if you could give governments, if you could give the agriculture industry kind of one piece of advice as to how, what it will take to get good, meaningful, ambitious outcomes that work for the sector on ag policy. What is that one piece of advice that you would give the different players involved? And so Grace, I'll go to you first to answer this question.
Well, it's to don't act unilaterally. I mean, don't, act collaboratively. It's going to take time to, build on the base that you've got. You have the trust relationships here, build in the farm community, all the people in the agri-food value chain. And ultimately, it has to be a collaborative exercise or it won't work. Yeah, that's it. You don't act unilaterally.
Harvey, to you, and then I'll go to Dan next. But Harvey, one piece of advice to give everybody involved?
Much along the same lines as Grace, it is meaningfully engage and involve industry in the dialogue. They're the ones that have to make the change. And if you don't have them on board, you're going to be rowing upstream.
Okay. Thank you. Dan, one piece of advice.
Yeah. I guess just one thought on the premise, it's like, if the federal government is going to ask people what they think, sometimes you need to put something on the table for people to react to, right? So the idea that you could consult and get agreement on the way to consult and then consult about the consultation, it gets a little bit challenging. It's the paper that was put forward. I'm not trying to say it's the be all and end all. I think no one would really say that, but something was put forward and it allowed for that engagement, right? And then I think the key thing that I would say, and my advice is, let's stay patient. Let's be patient with one another. Let's be flexible and open-minded, and let's try to find solutions, right? And that really leveraging some of the principles and the mechanics that Grace and Harvey were talking about.
Thank you, Dan. And Keith, my experience is that farm leaders always have lots of advice for government. What piece of advice would you give governments on this file?
Well, I love that Dan brought up the study stall theory that governments love to do. But it's certainly the concept of what everyone says is correct. And for me, whether it's advice to industry or advice to government, it's work with. There has to be that ability to work with each other. And I really think the strategy, the sustainable ag strategy is a really great first step in identifying the need from the ground. And it's not just for agriculture. This is a study or a strategy that can be used with all aspects of government. All ministries can look at this strategy because, as I said earlier, it's going to take more than just agriculture ministries to really make any kind of a forward progress. So let's work together. And as Dan said, you got to be patient. Like, you got to walk before you run on this. And so that would be my recommendation. Great.
Thank you, Keith. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining us. Thank you to Keith, Dan, and Harvey, and particular thank you to Dr. Skogstad. Grace's paper that came out earlier this week, again, is a pretty interesting read for those of us that understand the important role that FPT relations play and the need to work together. So thank you to the four of you. Thank you as well to the RBC Foundation for their support for this project. Again, it is that funding that that makes this possible. So thank you to Gwen for joining us and to the Foundation for their ongoing support for the work that we're doing on these initiatives. This webinar will be up on our YouTube channel shortly, so please feel free to share that with your friends and colleagues that weren't able to join us today, and we look forward to everyone joining us for the next Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute webinar. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.